So, welcome everyone to session number 2 of the remote CCBC book discussion. Um, so, I was going to try today to produce this slightly different format where I would actually appear via video in the PowerPoint. But unfortunately, when I do it that way, it takes hours and hours to upload uh, onto YouTube, and so it's just at this point it's not feasible. So I'm just going to do the voiceover again. Um, so a few things I wanted to mention. One, so if you're interested in taking the book discussion class for the spring semester, um, I've talked to Patrick, and the spring semester is going ahead. Um, they're planning on starting out, at least the classes will be done remotely, and then hopefully at the appropriate time when we're allowed to switch back, it will switch back over to regular classes. Um, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the remote classes, not this way on YouTube videos, but through something that's called Zoom. Zoom is like a video conferencing technology, and uh, it will be just like being in class, except it will be through your computer. So all you need is some sort of computer, phone, laptop, iPad. I think it will pretty much work on any platform or device. And I also don't think you don't have to download anything. What will happen is you will receive a link, and if you just click on the link, you will automatically go to the class, and I will teach the class live, and you can ask questions live, and we can have a live group discussion, just as we would in class. So I just wanted to let you know about that in case you are interested. And if you are interested, here are the books that we are going to be looking at for the spring semester. So I had told you that our first book is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. I picked that title before the pandemic kicked in, or otherwise I wouldn't have picked such a morbid sounding title. I don't think it's not really that morbid a book. It's as I mentioned before, the title is taken from a William Blake poem, the British Romantic poet. And it's actually sort of like a mystery, almost like a mystery thriller book. But it's by Olga Tokarczuk, who won the Nobel Prize, I believe, last year. The second book will be Night Boat to Tangier by Kevin Barry. Number 3 will be Olive Again by Elizabeth Strout. Of course, Olive Kitteridge is the character there, which we read a few years ago now. Our fourth book will be The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, which I've heard good things about. And lastly will be The Topeka School by Ben Lerner. The Topeka School also, I think all of these books came out in 2019. The Drive Your Plow came out earlier in Polish, but I think the English translation came out in 2019. And all the other books, I'm almost positive, came out in 2019. So these are all very recent books. The Topeka School is Ben Lerner's third novel. Ben Lerner, at least initially, was primarily known as a poet. I mean, he's still a poet, but he's more widely known now as a novelist. He's sort of a 30-something, a millennial, and the Topeka School takes place in Topeka, Kansas. And I believe Ben Lerner grew up in Topeka, Kansas. his parents were psychologists at, I believe it's called the Menninger Clinic, um, which is a very famous clinic for psychologists. And so there's a clinic in the book that's sort of based on that. It's fiction, but so the story is the story of two young men from sort of varied backgrounds. One sort of very privileged and upper middle class, and the other from a more challenging standpoint. So those are the books we'll be looking at if you're interested. Moving on. So I thought I would go through a list of books having to do with Iran in case you're interested. And Sharon from class had actually brought this to my attention. It had slipped my mind. I was familiar. I have the book on my bookshelf. I've never got around to reading it, but it's supposed to be a really interesting book, and it came out in 2003 and got a lot of attention. And it's written by an Iranian woman who is also an English professor, and so it's called Reading Lolita in Tehran, and it's about sort of coming of age during the transitional time of revolutionary Iran, the 70s moving into the late 70s with the revolution, and I guess the tension, between some of the books they were reading, the more Western-oriented books. I know in the book itself, it's nonfiction, of course, but the book is divided into four sections: Lolita, Gatsby, James, and Austin. So it's sort of an interesting viewpoint of the sort of Eastern Iranian revolutionary perspective seen through the eyes of Western literature and a more Western sensibility. Another book that you may find interesting is by Marjan Satrapi, and it's Persepolis, the story of a childhood. This is actually a graphic novel, and very highly acclaimed as a graphic novel. It came out, I believe, in the early 2000s. There are two volumes of this book. One, and the second one is Persepolis 2. But it's again nonfiction. It's a nonfiction story told through the viewpoint of a young girl, and based on the author's life growing up in Iran and then going through the revolution and then moving to the United States. And here is some of the artwork from the graphic novel. It was actually made into a movie. Very interesting artwork, this sort of stark black and white coloring. This is another book on Anahita's Woven Riddle. This is called Searching for Hassan, A Journey to the Heart of Iran by Terence Ward. And again, a story about sort of someone who initially grew up in Iran and then moved to the West and then went back to Iran later, and sort of reinvestigates and reorientates. The author reorientates himself to how life has changed in Iran. This is another nonfiction book, All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. So, looking at the origins of at least some of the issues in the Middle East through the lens of the 1953 coup in Iran, which again was orchestrated by Western intelligence agencies, and sort of the blowback over the years of what happened because of that, the sort of meddling in international affairs. This is called Funny and Farsi. Again, a memoir of growing up Iranian in America. So again, this point of view of an Iranian in America, growing up in America. This is the Saffron Tales. This is sort of interesting. It's recipes from the Persian kitchen. So a sort of different slant here. And finally, another nonfiction book, In Search of Zarathustra, across Iran and Central Asia to find the world's first prophet. I think a lot of Westerners are probably familiar with the name Zarathustra via Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote the famous book, the German Romantic philosopher, who wrote the book Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is also the title of the song from Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was also used. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was the song that Elvis Presley would use as he was taking the stage later in his career in the 1970s. It was interesting, this sort of all the different uses of this this word, of this from this early Middle Eastern religion, an early prophet. So what I would like to do now is I'm going to show a bit of this. This is another interview with Marjan Kamali, and just to give some additional background to the book. I did receive a few comments on the book. I'd be interested to hear what people think. There were sort of various viewpoints of the book. Some seem to think that the sort of setup of the novel was maybe a bit hokey. This sort of young love and then meeting, much later in life. While others didn't think that at all. They actually had found it realistic and had their own experiences of similar stories in one way or another in their lives. And others, there was some critique about perhaps some of her, language was a bit trite at times. So just mentioning a few of the comments I received. So we'll listen to this and see what she has to say. So I'm just going to start this at the 3-minute mark.
Ron?
Okay, here we go.
No matter where I was, the country I was living in was the country I was living in, and the home I was living in was Iran. Yes. Iranian, at least.
Yes. So the stationery shop, this book here, takes place in 1953, Iran. It's a time of upheaval in Iran. Most Americans don't know this period, right? But it's very important in Iranian history, and America plays an important part in this history. Can you tell us a little bit about the historical events, what was happening, and why you chose this period?
Yeah, I chose 1953 because I had grown up hearing about 1953. For a lot of Iranians, that was the turning point in the 20th century that changed the course of their country. My generation, my parents' generation would say is obsessed with 1979 because that was the revolution that affected us the most as children.
Yeah.
But 1953 was the year of a coup. There was a democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh, who was beloved by many, not by all.
Yeah.
There was the Shah as we know him, from the 1979 revolution. He was young then. And then there was a growing communist faction in Iran. So the country was divided and polarized between mainly three factions: communists, pro-prime minister, pro-Shah.
Right. And so the democratically elected government, the National Front Party, right, was overthrown. Right.
Yes.
How was Britain and America involved in this? It's a leading question.
It's a leading question. Well, I guess up until just a couple of years ago, one would say they weren't involved if they were here in the U.S., but now the CIA has declassified a lot of documents that show that the UK and the US had a hand in the coup. And they wanted the coup to happen. That's not to say Iranians were completely innocent victims. There were a lot of Iranians who also wanted the coup. But the fear was that Iran would go communist. And the idea was that the prime minister was a bit too independent and he was wanting to nationalize the oil, and so they didn't like that. The Anglo-Iranian oil company had a huge role in Iran.
I have to say, this is a lot about oil, isn't it? It was an economic, Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, which became British Petroleum as we know it, right?
Yes.
And then he when Eisenhower came in, the British yelled "communist, communist," and in 1953, yelling "communist" was quite a stir, and it prompted the United States to action, right?
Yes, Truman resisted, but I think Eisenhower was really worried about the communist threat, and so he finally agreed.
And he paid a bunch of people, the CIA, and they paid a bunch of people to come into the Capitol and make some demonstrations and et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, I mean, they sort of, they fueled the fire. There were already demonstrations happening. Maybe it wouldn't have gone to this extent. And you could argue, people are still arguing about it to this day. Oh, maybe the prime minister shouldn't have done this in parliament. Maybe, the Shah shouldn't have done that. Maybe the communists, but at the end of the day, that's what happened. The coup happened in one day.
So now your beautiful book, The Stationery Shop, takes that as the backdrop, and we get to understand the history by reading really a love story, right?
Yes.
It's about two 17-year-olds. Tell us a little about them. Where do they meet? They meet in the stationery shop, which is kind of like a bookstore, right? Tell us.
Yeah, so the stationery shop is a shop. It's on the corner of Hafez Avenue and Churchill Street in 1953, Iran. I made it up, but it is based on many shops that were similar to it at the time. These were stationery shops that also sold books. So they functioned as both a bookstore and a stationery store. And in fact, a lot of our independent bookstores now sell stationery to stay in business too.
Right.
Roya is a young 17-year-old high school student. She goes to the best high school in all of Tehran, and she's quite ambitious. Her dad is very ambitious for her. But at heart, she's basically an idealist, and the stationery shop is her favorite place to escape all the demonstrations in the streets and sort of the polarizing factions that are dividing everybody. And then one day she meets Bahman, this young 17-year-old activist who sort of bursts into the shop with a huge, of course, gust of wind.
Yeah.
And then they fall passionately in love, as only 17-year-olds can do, so intensely, so quickly. and they kind of have a whirlwind romance, and they feel like they're going to be together forever, and they're engaged to be married.
Yes.
But then, of course, everything goes terribly wrong because it's fiction.
Because because he's a political activist, right?
He's a political activist, so he's very idealistic, and he's working for the National Front, and he wants democracy for Iran. So he's a political activist and very brave. But as you know, because you read the book, family duties and family history dictates his own path too.
Yeah.
So he's not really able to fully engage politically even.
Yeah. So in case you're joining us, this is New England Authors, and we're speaking with Marjan Kamali. Her book is The Stationery Shop. So then they're engaged to be married. What I found interesting was your depiction of Iran as a traditional patriarchal society, right? The man, the father in this case, decides whether his daughter, his son is going to marry, right?
He doesn't so much decide, but it is a patriarchal society, and he has a lot of say. But the women have a lot of say. The mothers have a lot of say too.
We do actually go into the backstory a bit. You do go in, and you go back. So most of this takes place in 1953, but you do go back to 1919 and talk about the bookshop owner and how he emerged as well. But the story starts in New England, doesn't it? It starts in 2013. Was that 50 years after? Or 60 years 60. After the revolution. The two lovers have never seen each other. And so I'm not going to give away the story because you have to get to the end to find out why, right? And there are a lot of surprises along the way, and not least in the ending. But why did you take this inspiration? Why did you start in New England 2013? These two star-crossed lovers didn't see each other for 60 years.
For 6 years. It was actually really important to me to start then. I wanted to start when they were 77 and not when they were 17. And I wanted the reader to know from the very first chapter that they weren't together, because this is a story about lost love, not just teenage love.
Yes.
And to frame the story that way, I think, sets a tone where, as a reader, you know that they were not together for 60 years, and now they're seeing each other again for the first time. And then we go back in time and kind of see how they fell in love and see the progression of events that led them to that place. But I think it would be a very different story if we started when they were 17. I think with plot and with storytelling, the order of events that the reader receives makes all the difference.
I could see that you spent a lot of time on this book, right? It's very... It's very well written, and the plot. You probably changed it. The characters probably changed as you wrote it. How long did it take to write it, do you think?
Well, I started it 1 year after Together Tea came out, and I finished the first draft 2.5 years later, and then I spent an additional year revising it.
Yeah.
And just sort of really delving deeper and restructuring a lot. So thank you for saying that you think that it shows that I worked hard, because I really did.
Yes.
This was really, for me, it was a challenge to do a plot that had twists and turns, and I set myself up to do that. I really wanted to do that.
So Iran has been in the news.
So that is a bit of Marjan Kamali being interviewed by the New England Book Club. So just to wrap up today, if you would like to leave any comments on your thoughts on the stationery shop, whether you thought it was compelling or and believable, this relationship between the two main characters, or not, or any thoughts on the actual prose style, the writing, dialogue, please feel free to do so. And you can either email me or you can leave it in the YouTube comments down below. And again, if you're interested in the spring semester, it will be via Zoom, and it will should be interesting because we can actually once again actually have a book discussion as a group rather than just listening to me. Okay, so thank you. I hope you all are well, and I look forward to seeing you soon.